Title of today's message is called Phobia. Mark chapter 6, verses 43 to 52. And it says that they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up to a mountainside to pray. And evening came, and the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about fourth watch of the night, he came to them, and walking on the sea, he meant to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded. And they did not understand the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Amen. Phobia, the word phobia, if you look into some definitions in the world, says an extreme or irrational fear of something. Some psychological disorder, right? Extreme irrational fear of something, or exaggerated, usually inexplicable, illogical fear of a particular object or situation. That's what phobia is in a worldly definition, but actually the word phobia means fear, Greek word for fear, which in this passage, whenever the passage uses the word fear, it's phobia, noun form of phobia. So fear is really lighter form of this, what we consider as phobia in this world, lighter form of that. But the essence is the same. So we can talk about it through this passage. Fear affects us because sometimes it's very helpful thing that keeps us from harm. We should fear some things, like don't run into wall, or be careful when you drive. Don't jump from high places. Don't touch the fire. There's some form of fear is good for us. It helps us to guard ourselves. But many times it's an inner voice and barrier that keeps us stuck, not being able to progress in our lives. That keeps us from living maximally. Someone said, too many people are thinking of security instead of opportunity. They seem to be more afraid of life than death. Some validity to that. They are afraid to live. They're afraid to take chance and do things. They are afraid to live even more than death. Another person said, don't fear failure so much that you refuse to do new things. That saddest summary of life contains 3 descriptions: could have, might have, and should have. So if we're not doing the things we should be doing, fear will keep us from doing the things that we should be doing. Every time we give a message like this, though, you can misapply and say, just doing anything. Okay, I'm going to overcome fear, and for the sake of overcoming fear, you do some dumb things, or leave, or do weird things. That's not what it means. Doing the right things, making sure fear is not stopping you from doing the right things, doing things, maximally living for the kingdom of God. Another person said, anything I've ever done that ultimately was worthwhile initially scared me to death. Sometimes there's just fear in the beginning, and we need to go through those things. So it either means fear means forget everything and run, or face everything and rise. And I pray that we'll face the right things. As long as there's the right things to do, we'll face everything and rise, not run from those things. So as we look into this passage, especially when we are starting a new segment of the year during this summer. I believe it will be helpful to us so that we will not maintain status quo in our fear, but progress in our spiritual life, in our callings, even smaller things, smaller faithfulness in our lives, that fear will not retain us, contain us into mediocrity and mundaneness. But mundane faithfulness, keep growing, progressing, doing maximum for the kingdom of God. 4 lessons about fear so that we can live maximally for the Lord in this summer as well as for life. 4 things, 4 lessons here. We need to be ready. First lesson is this: we need to be ready to face different fear factors in life. That's the first thing. We need to be ready to face different fear factors in life, because situations will come in our lives. Some fear factor in our lives. Different things will cause us to fear. For some people, it's like different kinds of things. Some people, it's elevator. Maybe they had bad experience with elevator. Just going into elevator, they have fear. Some people, it's airplane. Some people, it's height. Some people, it's people. Some people, it's finals. Some people like finals. A lot of people fear finals. Writing papers. Finals, okay, but writing papers, they fear. What do you fear? Sometimes it's someone bigger than you. Sometimes some of the things that you cannot do. Sometimes it's fear of being rejected. For some of you, it's future, it's next year, grad school, job, marriage, future, some situations. Some people, it's ghost, which even in this passage, disciples were afraid of a ghost, thinking Jesus actually was a ghost. Where did this situation of fear start? We see in Genesis, book of Genesis. In the beginning, here's hardships and difficulties started to come, so we fear. Right? Genesis 3:16, after Adam and Eve sinned, it says, to the woman, God said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you will bring forth children. And your desires will be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. How he talks about relational hardships and difficulties and pain will come. So our fears have to do with these kinds of difficulties that come. We don't want to face those things. Relational pain, but also there's situational, circumstantial pain as a consequence of sin. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 17, it says, and to Adam, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground. So somehow man was to be in dominion of the world, but just when they were in rebellion against God, the world started to be in rebellion against mankind, so that we will learn what we have done to God so that we can come to repentance. Cursed is the ground because of you. Ground was affected. In pain you shall eat of it, and all the days of your life. And we can see the different kinds of fears because of the pain and hardship that comes. In Mark chapter 6, in this chapter, there were actually, we compare between Mark chapter 4 and Mark chapter 6, 2 kinds of water situation, fearful situation comes to the disciples' life. Chapter 4, disciples were actually afraid of the storm. Right? When you look at the verse in Mark 6, verse 50, for they all saw him and were, Mark chapter 4, verse 37 says, great storm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, and that's what they were afraid of. But Mark chapter 6, they were afraid of a personal being, in fact, Jesus, but they thought Jesus was personal spiritual beings, ghost, right? Ghost. So they were afraid of 2 things: personal beings, relational fear, relational pain, and situational, natural disaster, situational circumstances that were not in control, which is what Mark chapter 6 is about. And we know that those kinds of pain and suffering situations that we fear started in Genesis chapter 3. These factors are results of sin. We are afraid of people, sinful beings, or sin-affected world. But God's grace comes even as consequences to sin. That sometimes in the sinful world, people will be afraid of people, will be afraid of circumstances, but God's grace is there so that we can, not trust in those things, not trust in people, and not trust in the circumstances, situation that we can overcome by ourselves, but we can trust God alone. We need to compare, I feel like in this point, we need to compare fear and worry a little bit because it's very similar. So I have to think about that, fear and worry. And I concluded two things maybe in comparison. One is fear is more focused on threat or dangers than worry. Worry, you worry about something. It could be worry about smaller things, but fear is some kind of threat. Right? Focus on threat or danger. Something is in danger. So worry is a state of anxiety, uncertainty over actual potential problems. But fear is unpleasant or strong emotion caused by anticipation or awareness of danger. We can kind of think like that, right? Caused by danger. Another difference is that fear is a bit more object-oriented. Subject or object-oriented. Worry surrounds ultimately what we fear. For example, let's say you are worried about whether door is locked or not. Some of the OCD people are like that, right? So they constantly worry about is the door locked, and they check it about 20 times. But you don't really fear whether the door is locked or not. It might be semantics, That's why it's difficult to. Some people use it differently. It's difficult to define both and compare. But just in general, worry. You don't fear whether the door is unlocked or not. Door is locked or not. You worry about that because what you fear is when the door is not locked, my family will be harmed. So they are related, maybe, but fear is maybe greater in a sense that you are worried about certain kind of danger to something that is important to you, and you worry kind of surrounds that. Another person, one author, kind of compared it like this. I thought it was fascinating. She said, worry is the junk food for your fears. Sorry if you like junk food. I don't like junk food, so I can say negative things about junk food. Worry is junk food for your fears. Worry is full of empty calories. When fears swell from unproductive negative thinking, right, like worrying, meaning worry is strengthening your fear. And fear comes out of fear you worry, but worry kind of strengthens your fear. So if you trace your worries into the deep part of yourself, I believe there's something you fear. Phobia, all kinds of phobia is related. Worry and fear related. Panic attack is, what we fear, what we worry, and it's related. And we have physical effect. OCD symptom is, I counsel these people. OCD symptom, you worry and fear, so you constantly do things so that you can be control of those things. Many of these often psychologically related labor disorder is related to your heart. So we need to examine heart, we'll get to the next point, but one person said, we are more often frightened than hurt. And we suffer more from imagination than reality. Isn't that true? What we worry about, what we fear, probably, I don't know what percentage of it actually happens in our lives. But we are suffering more from our imagination. We might not have imagination according to good things, and we need to have imagination according to good things. Like God says in Ephesians 3, He can do more than we can ask or imagine. We need to imagine how great and awesome God is, yet we imagine about what things will happen that will cause us harm. Often we think, we have this train of thoughts about worries. and our fear. I was thinking about what's worse, being frightened or being hurt. You're frightened about a person, yet you're hurt by a person, let's say. What's worse? Okay, it's debatable, but I was thinking from one angle, it's like this. If you're hurt, at least we learn less if we haven't even tried. So many of my growth in my spiritual life as a person is from pain. Pain is such a wonderful teacher. Pain is a terrible friend. I don't want him around. But he's a wonderful teacher. Pain still teaches you, helps you to grow. But if you don't try because you fear, you're not even in a vicinity of those things that will help you to grow. So we learn less if we haven't even tried and haven't had the chance to get hurt. You always protect yourself. Often, through getting hurt, we can learn. Often, as you get hurt, you can learn to be wise, older one. Without getting hurt, you often remain as a child. So, if it's a right thing, I'm not saying do anything to get hurt. Okay, can you hit me? Not like that, right? But in doing the right things, don't fear pain. Because even through your failures, you can grow if you're doing the right thing. One person said, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. Plato said this, we can easily forgive a child who is afraid of the dark. But the real tragedy of life is when men are afraid of the light. Wow, I thought it was a great quote. I'll read it again. You're thinking about something else. I'll read it again. We can easily forgive a child who is afraid of the dark, but the real tragedy of life is when men are afraid of the light. Meaning, when you're afraid of doing something that is right, we are afraid of the light. We need to be afraid of certain things, but if you continue to do that, you remain as a child. You got to grow so that we can do the right things and do not fear if you're doing the right things. Let's go to the second point, which is, first we talked about we need to be ready to face different fear factors in life, and we all have different kinds of fears, and we'll face different kinds of fears in the phases of our life. But secondly, we can see what we are made of through our fears. Look at this passage. End verse of this passage in Mark chapter 6, verse 52, it says, they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. So sandwiched between the story about the loaves, Jesus feeding 5,000, is this story. And it seems like Jesus is helping them, letting them go through this story because this situation in the water, because their hearts were hard. Look at the previous verse. It's about giving bread, right? Mark chapter 6, verse 43. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. So Jesus fed 5,000, probably 12, meaning each disciple saw the leftover, saw the miraculous power of Jesus Christ. And it was like each basketful left for disciples, it was for them to get fed. Not only physically, but spiritually. Wow, Jesus is awesome. Jesus is the bread of life. Mark 6, verse 44, and those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. But their hearts were still hard, maybe, and it seems like this passage is saying that's why God leads them through these things. Right? So, I think it goes like this. If you do not understand the meaning of the bread, which Jesus says, I am the bread of life. He's trying to help the disciples understand. If you do not understand the meaning of the bread, He will lead you through the storm. So get it when He gives you bread. Get it when He speaks to you. Otherwise, He leads you through the circumstances so that, not through the word, but circumstances, hardships, and difficulties, He will teach you. If giving of the bread does not lead you to grow in your faith, He will take away the sun, possibly safety in your life to give you Himself. One thing for sure though is that He will never leave you nor forsake you. He will never take away himself from you. In fact, everything he does is to give himself to you. Their hearts, when he says their hearts were hardened, their hearts were so full of themselves. Their hearts were so full of themselves. And their hearts were so hardened full of themselves. So their hearts could not take the bread of life that helps them to grow. So he takes away. He takes away from their hearts to fill them with himself. What specific things were in their hearts? We can see few things. Jesus is going to talk about himself, give himself through his revelation. So we know that they were full of ignorance. Their hearts were full of ignorance. Misunderstanding about Jesus, lack of understanding about Jesus, probably thoughts about worldly things, thoughts about how to catch fish. Not that those things are useless, but those things, they had some kind of knowledge, but lack of knowledge about Jesus Christ. Ignorance and doubt, right? Here's Jesus walking on water. It goes, he's a ghost. Lack of understanding of himself and lack of faith. And even in this passage, they were, and Mark chapter 4 as well as Mark chapter 6, problems were so much greater than the problem solver. Sometimes our problem is so much bigger than God. And when people talk about their problems, I go, are you a Christian? Do you believe in God? Where is God in your narrative? In your story? Where is God? Do you ever think about the fact that he's with you? Maybe he's training you, guiding you, protecting you, under and over, around, before and after. He's with you. Ignorance, doubt. But in the midst of our hearts, ignorance and doubt, there's love for ourselves. We don't want pain. We want pleasure. That's what our heart wants. Galatians chapter 5. So in the midst of fear, we need to see what it wants. What do I want? What it feels. What are you feeling? All kinds of feelings. Maybe towards other people, towards circumstances, towards God. You face problems and everything is sourced to blame. It's about everyone else's problem. It's God's problem if He's not giving me what I want. What He feels, what He says. Listen to what your fear says. Listen to what your fear thinks. And please listen to what fear chooses. What choice you make. In the essence of our heart, whether you're in fear, whether you are in worry, two things there. I talked about pleasure or pain. Fear of not getting what you want. Our heart, we always want what we want in our sin nature. Of course, we have a spirit nature. We always want what God wants. We want Him. We want Christ. But in the midst of our fear, as our sinful nature, sinful desires operate, fear of not getting what we want pleasure. Seeking for maximum pleasure, highest pleasure at one moment. Or fear of getting what we don't want, pain, displeasure, suffering, hardships, difficulty. We don't want that. We always want more pleasure, less pain. Maximum pleasure, minimum pain. That's how our hearts operate, and that's what we're made of. And you need to be able to see that. It's not about other things. It's never about, is first and foremost, never about other things, situations, other people. It's about my heart. You gotta learn how to examine your heart. If you wanna grow, become productive, if you wanna help other people, you wanna grow in your spiritual life, it's always about your heart. Because when we want pleasure and we don't want pain, for example, when you don't want pain, when you see something, right? You don't want pain, I don't want pain, and then it's gonna take you to the past pain, and it reminds you of that pain, and then what it does is it cripples you because of the pain to make the right choice. No, minimum pain choice rather than though there will be pain, though there will be hurt, I'm going to love, I'm going to serve, I'm going to step out in faith and serve that person. Memory activates. You can even be reminded of physical symptoms, right? that kind of pain is a warning sign. So it could be a good pain, right? Or it's like a bleeding in your body. It could be a good sign. Oh, there's something wrong with your body. Take care of it. Right? So whenever we warrior fear, it could be a good thing. That maybe you should stop. You should not do certain things. But often when it is related to sinful nature, you got to do the right thing. You got to do the right thing. Sometimes doing the right thing is listening to fear. Sometimes doing the right thing is overcoming fear. You need to always analyze what is the right thing to do biblically at the time with wisdom. But sometimes memory of the past pain can cripple us. I love this comic strip. It's a comic strip, Peanuts. Lucy explains Charlie Brown at the end of the game why he had lost the sight of baseball. Sight of the baseball. There's a time, it's a considerable time when the ball comes out and you have to catch it. And she talks about why she had lost the sight of baseball and had failed to make the catch. And this is what it says. Sorry, I missed the early fly ball, manager. I thought I had it, but suddenly I remembered all the others I had missed. And the past got in my eyes. How often does your past get in your eyes? How often does a memory of the pain gets into your eyes and you choose wrong things or you make mistakes in your life? Word of God has to be in your eyes. Promises of God has to be in your eyes. And God's grace, availability of God's grace and power and strength and forgiveness has to be in your eyes more than your fear of failure. This fear of failure distracts us from focusing on the right things. It distracts us from focusing on what we ought to do, our calling. It distracts us from focusing on who we should it for, our motive. It fails to distracts us from focusing on whom we should trust for our strength, our power. So, these fear of failure, fear distracts us from focusing on our calling, our motive, and our power to do the right thing. Our calling, what we ought to do, our motive, who we should it for, and our power, whom we need to trust for our strength. Soren Kierkegaard said this: to dare is to lose one's footing momentarily. To not dare is to lose oneself. Wow, so deep. When you keep living in your failures, you are not becoming yourself. You are not living out whom God has made you to be. Robert Frost said, the best way out is always through. So if it's the right thing, go at it. Never be afraid to try something new. Right? Remember, amateurs built the ark, and professionals built the Titanic. God blesses you. Sometimes it might be a new thing. You're not even great at it, but God's going to use it to save lives. Expand His kingdom. Henry Ford said, one of the greatest discoveries a man makes, one of his great surprises is to find he can do what he was afraid he couldn't do. You always thought, there's no way I can do this, but you do it. Oh! I can do this. We call that maybe breakthrough. Got to learn to experience some, if it's the right thing. Learn to experience breakthrough moments, especially spiritual breakthrough moments. And you'll experience His amazing power and grace in your life. Let's go to the third point, which we talked about. We need to be ready to face different fear factors in our lives. We need to see what we're made of through our fears. And thirdly, we can grow to be courageous in the midst of our fears. Two things there. What Jesus is doing in our fears and what should we do in our fears. Sometimes we ask questions, God, what are you doing? And this picture has a vivid picture of when disciples are going through fears. in the midst of waters, and Jesus walks on water, Jesus come back to them. Now, what Jesus was doing? Few things here. What is Jesus doing in our fears? We can see in this passage, he leads us into our fears. Mark chapter 6, verse 45, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat. It's he himself makes disciples get into the boat. God can lead us to situations. If bread doesn't work, waters. Giving the bread doesn't work, takes away safety. Second thing, he prays for our fears. He doesn't just leave us there, he prays for us. Mark chapter 6, verse 46, after he had taken loaves of them, he went up on the mountainside to pray. At the right hand of God, he's interceding for us. He's praying for us always. Thirdly, he leaves us alone in our fears. And as when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone in the land. That means he was not with them. Though he's with us in prayer and everything, sometimes he leaves us alone so that we can struggle in our fears, so that our faith muscles can grow. Fourthly, he is watching over us in our fears. Verse 48 says, and he saw that they were making headway painfully. Even though they're going through pain, he painfully abstains himself from helping. Sometimes mom sees a child falling down. It's painful for her not to go. But she waits so that through his pain and her pain, the child can grow. Considerable time later in verse 48, the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. So he's watching over us in our fears. Right? And then we see in verse 5, he is waiting for his time in our fear. Fourth watch of the night, right time he comes to help them. He waits, sometimes he waits, he watches over us, and then he comes at the right time because he wants to fill our hearts in our fears. Verse 52, for they did not understand because their hearts were hardened. So he empties their heart of selfishness, lack of faith, pride, so that their hearts can be filled with himself or with Jesus Christ. So what should we do in our fear? Just this phrase, one phrase, take heart, it is I, don't be afraid. Right? Three things, take heart. That means it's a command. It's a plural command. It's given to all the believers in Jesus Christ. It's imperative. We have no choice but to be courageous. Take heart. Be courageous, which means to be firm, to resolute in the face of danger, adverse circumstances. Be enheartened. To be courageous. This is what we ought to do in our lives. You know, to sin nature, spiritual nature, sin nature may sometimes will cause us to be in fear. But in spiritual nature, we have to be courageous. We need to be courageous in doing the right thing. Often, when we are able to deny ourselves, selflessness will always lead us to courage. Take heart. And then second part, then how can I take heart? The foundation is seeing this. It is I. Second thing there. It really is the phrase I am. It's a term described in Exodus chapter 3. It's the name of God in the Old Testament. Right? So Jesus is declaring that he is God. I am. Jesus is declaring, I am. I've been existing on my own ever since the beginning of time. I'm the creator. I'm the only creator. God is the only one who was and is to come. Jesus Christ is declaring his deity, saying, I am. It's a singular present indicative, which means I am God who is here now with you. So we can be courageous because God, Jesus Christ is with us. Jesus is all we need. Jesus is saying, I am. Oh, you're afraid of the storm? I am the Lord of the storm. You're afraid of this water? The storm is just puddle of water to me. I am the one who created whatever you are in fear of. I am the one who made those beings. Whatever situations that you're afraid of, I am in control of every single particle, molecule, cell in this universe. I am God. He doesn't give sermon about how to roll better. He doesn't give a sermon about psychologically overcoming these things. He just says, I am. You don't need anything else. You don't need any other sermon. Right? I am God. And the third thing he says is, therefore don't be afraid. Do not be afraid. Meaning, how to be courageous is, don't see the problem and compare God to the problem, and God problem becomes bigger. No. First and foremost, see God. See God enough that He's so almighty. He's a creator. He's in control of everything. He created every being that we can possibly be afraid of. Think about Him and then put problems under that. See God first, then see the problem with the proper perspective. If we can see the problem, it's not saying be blinded of your problems. No, Christianity is realistic, practical. It's not blind faith. No, Christianity is faith based on the Word, based on the reality of who God is. So see God first, and as you see the problem from the perspective of God, make sure you have a proper perspective of your problems. Nelson Mandela said, I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but triumph over it. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear. So we fear. We are afraid. But make sure we put that fear into proper perspective in light of who God is. Dale Carnegie was a little more practical. He says, inaction breeds doubt and fear. Action breeds confidence and courage. If you want to conquer fear, do not sit at home and think about it. Go out and get busy. Do something as you serve the Lord. Crippling fear has turned into practical faithfulness. You heard this wonderful story. I can never forget this part in Narnia where Aslan, lion, Christ figure, speaks to little girl Lucy. And Lucy one day looks at Aslan and goes, are you bigger? Meaning, hey, you look bigger. Are you growing? Says to Aslan. And Aslan says, no, I'm not bigger, you are. And as you grow bigger, as you grow older, I will look bigger. God Himself is as big as you can imagine. He's omnipotent, mighty God. The reason why He's not big enough is because we are little, we are small, we are young, we are immature. But as we mature and as we grow, we will see Him as who He is. And He would look bigger as we grow, mature, older. Let's put a problem with proper perspective under God. Let's go to fourth thing. Last but not least is we must be hungry for more in our fears. We can grow courageous in the midst of our fear, but we can be hungry for more grace, more of Christ in our fears. I just want to emphasize this was just think about this phrase in Mark 6:48. He meant to pass by them. This is the most important thing inside. If you forget about everything, that's okay. You got to understand this before you walk out. Okay. Somebody's sleeping, just wake them up now. Okay. 3 points. If you get this, you still get enough. Mark 6:48 says, he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the lake, and it says, he meant to pass by them. And you read this phrase so many times. If you carefully read this passage, you go, what in the world does it mean? Why did he mean to pass by them? Is he testing them so that, Jesus, grabbing them? Possibly. But I think he meant to pass by them is a technical phrase technical phrase that we get from the Old Testament. You know, last point was talking about how Jesus is all we need. This point is basically going to say Jesus is all we should want. He meant to pass by them. It's a phrase that, the I am, the name Jesus says, it is I, is from Exodus chapter 3. This phrase, he meant to pass by them, is in Exodus 33. So we need to look at the context a little bit. Let's examine this passage where this is Moses. Moses had personal relationship with God in such a way. Moses talked to God face to face. He had personal, intimate relationship with God. In Exodus 33, verse 17, he says, "And the Lord said to Moses," it was a usual day in his quiet time with God, "This very thing that you have spoken I will do, for you have found favor in my sight." And it says, "I know you by name." Does God know your name? I remember talking to a missionary, and he's walking in the ocean and by the sea, and then he's praying. He goes, "What are you doing?" He goes, "I'm making sure Jesus knows me." When you see him face to face, will he say, like Matthew chapter 7, "I don't know you, who are you?" Or will he say, "I know you by name"? You need to have personal, heart-to-heart encounter with Jesus. Pray that you have that daily. Exodus 33, verse 18 says, Moses said to them, "Please show me your glory." I mean, he had this intimate relationship with God, yet he was still more hungry for God. More you're mature, more you'll be hungry for more of God. Our hearts are filled with desires, and we are beings of addiction. The best addiction that we can have, if we are properly living out our Christian life, we'll be more and more addicted to God. More and more of Him. "Please show me your glory. More, I want more of you." Even though he was facing God day to day, "I want more of the essence of who you are. I want more of your glory, more of your beauty, more of your worth." He wanted more. He was hungry. And look at what God says in Exodus 33, verse 19. He's going to say this here, and he's going to say it a little bit later in another verse, a few verses later, and also next chapter, few times. Author is making sure this is a technical term. And he says, "I will make all my goodness," what does he say? "Pass before you." Pass by. He's making sure he's pouring his name, his knowledge, his revelation onto Moses. And knowing that Moses can only take this much at a time. It'll take whole eternity to take more of God, but he's just making sure he takes maximum. He's pouring his goodness. Pass before you. He's revealing it. This is a language of revelation. Language of pouring. Language of pouring his love, his grace, himself upon Moses. "All my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim before you my name." Making sure this is a technical language. Several other places in Old Testament uses this passage. Look at Job chapter 9, verse 8. "And who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea?" God is the one who tramples the waves of the sea, like what we see in the context of Mark chapter 6, who walks on water. And 9 verse 11 says, "Behold, he passes by me." He's revealing himself through those things. And Jesus is declaring, as he's trampling the waves of the sea, he's God himself. And he's revealing himself to them. Exodus 33 verse 21, he says, "And Lord said, Behold, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock." We cannot receive the revelation and live. We all die. But if we are standing on the rock, if we are placed on Jesus Christ, we can receive his revelation. Moses was standing on the rock. Apart from Jesus, we all die in God's holiness and wrath. But when we are standing on the rock, Jesus Christ is our foundation. We can receive his grace. Exodus 33 verse 22 says, when we are on Christ, God covers us. "I will cover you with my hand. I have passed by." He reveals to us. How does he reveal to us in our day? I've never faced God face to face, right? That's why Exodus 34 verse 1, he gives 10 commandments to Moses. The Lord said to Moses, cut for yourself 2 tablets of stone. Application for us, he passes by us. He reveals himself to us through his word. The most, and then he says, proof of whether we have received more of God, more of him, is this. Mark chapter 6, verse 50. For they all saw him, were terrified, but immediately he spoke to them and said, take heart, it is I, don't be afraid. They were in fear. Next verse, when Jesus passed by them, Jesus gave himself to them. Verse 51, and he got into the boat with them, and wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded. When we receive more of Jesus, our fear will turn to being astounded, to worship, to be mesmerized by his beauty and worth. And the most blessing factor, most blessing thing to me in Exodus, in this whole message and idea is just Exodus 33 verse 19. It says, it doesn't say I will make my goodness pass by you. It says I will make all my goodness pass by you. Again, I think God wants to make sure He wants our hearts to be so full of Him and overflow. Just filling every space, every corner of the cup of our hearts, being filled with Him. He's just pouring all His goodness, making sure our hearts are full. And one day at a time, as we grow, we'll be a little more full of Him. But His heart is always, He wants to give more. He's always pouring His goodness upon us. And more we grow, more we'll be filled with Him. And every day as we worship Him, He will look bigger. And our fear will turn to worship, which will lead us in our lives into faithfulness. We'll look at this one video clip and we'll finish. And it's just a praise song. Okay? It's long. It's about seven minutes, but it's worth it. Okay? It just summarizes what we talked about, how all creation is worshiping the Lord. If all creation, everything in this universe is worshiping the Lord, so will I. So let's watch this and then we're going to pray and worship.
All right, guys. So let's settle down some. We need you to sing this song with us. Listen up, listen up. God of creation, there at the start, before the beginning of time. With no point of reference, you spoke to the dark and fleshed out the wonder of life. And as you speak, 100 billion galaxies are born. In the vapor of your breath, the planets form. If the stars were made to worship, so will I. I can see your heart in everything you made. Every burning star, a signal fire of grace. If creation sings your praises, so will I. So will I. The stars were made to worship, so will I. If the mountains, yeah, yeah. If the oceans roar your greatness, so will I. For if everything exists to lift you high, so will I. If the wind goes where you send it, so will I. If the rocks cry out in silence, so will I. If the sum of all our praises still falls short, then we'll sing again 100 billion God of salvation, chase down my heart through all of my failure and pride. On a hill you created, the light of the world, abandoned in darkness to die. And as you speak, 100 billion. Woo! Where you lost your life, so I thank you, Lord. If you left the grave behind you, so I can see your heart in everything you've done. Every prayer, part design, and a work of art called love. If you gladly chose to surrender, so I can see your heart in billion different ways. Every precious one, a child you died to save. You gave your life to love him so like you would again 100 million times. But we never could amount to your love. You're the one who never left the one behind. Like you would again 100 billion times. Oh, what measure could mount. You're the one who never leaves the one behind. Like you would again 100 billion times. But what measure could amount to yours? Yes, the one who never leaves the one behind. You're the one who never leaves the one behind.
100 billion stars, 100 billion praises, 100 billion failures, and 100 billion forgiveness, 100 billion desires to chase after us. He will never leave one behind. That's why we should never fear. He's with us, and may we receive that kind of love to use all our energy and love to chase after the people who do not know Christ this summer. Let's pray.